So today we're jumping into one of the most complex ethical questions out there, right at the intersection of faith and science, embryonic stem cell research. We're going to unpack a really fascinating argument from one source that tries to find an answer by looking at both ancient texts and modern biology.
Right off the bat, the core conflict is pretty clear. On one hand, you have embryonic stem cell research, we'll call it ESCR for short, which has this absolutely incredible potential to cure diseases and save lives. But on the other hand, the process involves destroying a human embryo, and for many people of faith, that's a huge ethical problem. This whole dilemma really boils down to one single question. From a biblical point of view, when does a soul actually enter the body? Is it right there at the moment of fertilization, or does it happen sometime later? And the answer to that question, well, it changes everything. Now, to be clear, the source is very specific about what it means by ensoulment. It's not a biological process. It's seen as this distinct theological moment, something science just can't measure or observe. And that's exactly why the author has to look for clues in other places to build their case. Okay, so the first place the author goes looking for clues is the Bible, not as a science textbook, but as a place to find bigger, overarching patterns and principles. All right, so let's dive in and see what they found. The source zeroes in on two key stories, the creation of Adam in Genesis and Ezekiel's vision of the dry bones. And in both of these stories, you see the exact same sequence. First, a physical body is completely formed. Only after the body is complete is life or spirit breathed in. The author suggests this might be a pattern: body first, then life. The next clue is an analogy, and it's a pretty powerful one. The Bible often refers to human descendants as seed. Now think about a plant seed. It has all the potential for life, right? But it's dormant. It only becomes actively alive when you plant it in the soil. The source argues a fertilized egg is a lot like that. It can be frozen for years, only truly starting the process of life once it implants in the uterus. Okay, this next one is a little more complex and symbolic. The author draws a parallel with the ancient Levitical feasts. They line up Passover, which represents death, with fertilization. Then, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is linked to burial, is aligned with cell division. But here's the crucial part. The Feast of First Fruits, which symbolizes new life and resurrection, lines up perfectly with the moment of implantation. So in this symbolic view, new life doesn't actually begin until implantation. And the final biblical clue the author points to is the language itself. You look at these key scriptures that talk about the sanctity of life, in Psalms, in Jeremiah, and they all talk about God's work happening in the womb. The argument here is that this isn't just a coincidence. The focus is always on what happens after the embryo has implanted in the uterus. So that's the argument from the ancient texts. Next, the author turns to modern science. Now, the goal isn't to prove a soul exists, but to see if what we know from biology lines up with these biblical patterns. And this first piece of data is pretty surprising. According to the research cited in the source, the chances of a fertilized egg ever successfully implanting in the uterine wall is actually really low, only about 30%. That means a huge majority, the full 70% of all fertilized eggs, are naturally lost before a pregnancy even technically begins. This leads the author to ask a really tough theological question. Would God place a unique individual soul in every single fertilized egg, knowing that most of them are destined to be lost from the very start? And then you've got this fascinating biological reality, identical twins. This happens when a single fertilized egg actually splits into two separate, genetically identical individuals. This creates a real puzzle for the idea of ensoulment at fertilization. I mean, was there one soul that somehow split in two? Or did God place two souls in one embryo right from the beginning? The source suggests there might be a simpler alternative. What if God waits until after the split, ensouling each distinct individual at the moment they implant? And this is a big one. The source also points to the official medical definition of pregnancy. Medically speaking, a pregnancy does not begin at fertilization. It officially begins only when an embryo has successfully implanted itself in the uterine wall. Okay, so we've looked at clues from both the theology and science. Now, let's put it all together and weigh the evidence. Let's compare the two possible moments for when a life with a soul might begin: fertilization versus implantation. This table really pulls the whole argument together. Look at the contrast. At fertilization, the author sees the embryo as a seed that's still waiting to be planted. It has a low survival rate, and its individual identity isn't even set in stone because of twinning. But at implantation, well, now it's a planted seed,
pregnancy has medically begun and its individual identity is finally established. So after weaving together all these different threads, from biblical patterns to scientific data and even medical definitions, the source arrives at a very specific conclusion. And it's a conclusion with some major implications for that original stem cell debate. So here's the bottom line. Based on this whole collection of clues, the body first pattern, the seed analogy, the high failure rate, the twinning puzzle, and the medical definition, the source concludes that from this particular theological viewpoint, the most consistent moment for ensoulment isn't fertilization, it's implantation. And the impact of that conclusion is huge. If a soul is not present until implantation, then using an embryo or a blastocyst for stem cell research before it implants could be seen as ethically okay within this framework. Why? Because you wouldn't be destroying a human soul. And that really leaves us with a final, much bigger thought. This source presents a very detailed argument, trying to weave together clues from both scripture and the lab. But what it really highlights is the larger, more profound question at the very heart of this debate. When a decision with such high stakes has to be made, who gets to decide?